I'm Redbord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. Today, I sit down with the U.S. Treasury's Caroline Horres. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. In 2024, the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, implemented sanctions targeting entities and individuals involved in cryptocurrency-related activities, cybercriminals, North Korean threat actors, ransomware groups, terrorist financiers, and others. Sanctions have become, over the last few years, the #1 tool of U.S. foreign policy. Keeping up with global sanctions in the fast-moving world of finance and cryptocurrency is no small task. Organizations need to act quickly when new sanctions are announced, screening transactions and wallets, often within hours. TRM makes this possible, helping businesses automatically identify and block interactions with newly sanctioned individuals, companies, or wallets. This rapid response not only ensures compliance with global rules, but also protects businesses from fines, reputational harm, and from engaging with threat actors. But compliance doesn't stop at the official sanctions lists. Many bad actors operate through networks that aren't directly named, but are closely linked to those under sanctions. TRM's advanced technology goes deeper, mapping out these connections to uncover hidden risks. By understanding the full picture of who might be involved, businesses can address vulnerabilities they might not even know existed, giving them a stronger, more complete compliance framework. To truly stay ahead, businesses need to think proactively. That means keeping an eye on high-risk players, non-compliant exchanges, cybercriminal groups, and others that could end up on sanctions lists in the future. TRM's growing database of illicit activity helps organizations spot these potential threats and monitor areas of concern. By taking this forward-looking approach, companies can stay ahead of regulators and better protect themselves in an ever-changing sanctions landscape. All right, let's sit down with Caroline Horres. Caroline, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, thanks for having me.
I know you've been on before, and I feel like we have been in meetings together really all over the world, from Paris to Japan and all kinds of places. You're leading so much of the work, obviously the Treasury Department, but then globally. How does someone end up as, the cryptocurrency lead at the U.S. Treasury Department?
Yeah, and it's been a little bit indirect. And I think one of the most interesting things about kind of my journey thus far is some of my favorite jobs that I've had, I would have never known existed until I was, applying for them. But really, I came to Treasury not too long after graduate school. In college and graduate school, I had studied mostly Middle Eastern politics issues. And I studied Arabic in college, and I had known for quite a while that I had wanted to work in national security. And so in 2015, after graduate school, like so many others, I think that had similar paths, ended up working counter ISIS, because that was really the focus at the time. And I took a job doing research and analysis for the Treasury Department on that work. I had actually gotten a little bit lucky in college doing an internship for a local law firm in Charleston, South Carolina, that was bringing the case against Arab Bank. And I had done Arabic translation for them. So that kind of had tuned me into the terrorist financing aspect of kind of the national security work with a Middle East focus. So I think it kind of channeled me into this work at the Treasury Department. And I really, really loved doing that research and analysis on counter ISIS and counterterrorism financing work. But then COVID hit. And like so many other people, I found myself really trying to grapple with how I could do my job from home And where there's a lot of information about illicit finance that's available publicly, as you know, is in the virtual asset ecosystem. And so I just started digging because I had the time to dig. And about that time, too, as I was trying to really wrap my head around this technology, there was a trio of cases that the Department of Justice brought against, there was one against Al-Qassam brigades, one against Al-Qaeda, one against ISIS, all for their use of virtual assets. And so that was really something that I was able to dig into a lot. And I started thinking a lot more about it and decided I wanted to make the switch to policy to spend all of my time thinking about these issues.
That's amazing. And like, there's so many things to unpack there. Very recently, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal on Telegram, and it highlighted Christian Chesky, he's our head of global investigations at TRM, but he was the IRS CI agent on those three cases. And they talked about the way that Chris and Ryan Landers from HSI and Zia Faruqi and Jesse Brooks of the U.S. Attorney's Office, Kyle Armstrong at the FBI, really utilized Telegram channels as a jumping off point to investigating that case. And it was just really interesting questions around, look, illicit actors, terrorist financiers are using Telegram, but so are law enforcement to unravel some of these cases. Really amazing. And what a moment to be an expert on this area. You must sort of step back and say, it's incredible to look at this in a historical perspective, what we're seeing over there right now.
It absolutely is. And I think, to be honest, for quite a while, coming at this from starting looking at terrorist groups specifically, I think for quite a long time, it was, we should absolutely be looking at virtual assets, but we don't see a lot of activity in the TF context. So we want to be, keep an eye on it, but don't focus too much. I think we're kind of now in a position where we're increasingly seeing actors across the board using virtual assets, increasing their sophistication, understanding this a little bit better. We're not really in a position anymore where it's just, okay, North Korea and ransomware actors seem to be really good at this, but everybody else is at a pretty basic level. I think we're seeing others start to creep up. And so I think it is helpful to also make sure that we're thinking about this from that perspective.
Yeah, it's really important. I think that our view at TRM for a long time has been that, terror financiers are experimenting with cryptocurrency, and it's still nascent and still relatively small compared to the funding that they're getting from nation states and taxation and other types of means.
Right.
I think recently we really are starting to see these terror organizations slightly more than experiment. And that's probably just true. The crypto ecosystem is growing and there's more opportunity there, but we're seeing more and more. There's a recent Hamas indictment out of the Southern District of New York that really laid out, quite frankly, a lot on cryptocurrency, still relatively small amounts,
right.
But we're seeing more and more engagement. Is that what you're seeing at Treasury?
So I think maybe the best way to answer this question actually comes back to some conversations that we had in the context of working on the decentralized finance, illicit finance risk assessment, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the title regardless. I had several, as we do for our risk assessments, had several consultation conversations with different folks in the government and law enforcement, regulators, the intelligence community, really everybody. This is a whole of government effort. I'm going into a public report. So we want to make sure we really understand what the landscape looks like. And, I think we had got into that expecting to hear that, these specific groups use DeFi in this particular way, and those other groups, they never use it. We don't have to worry about them. But that really wasn't the story that we were hearing. Instead, it was more like within any kind of threat group, there could be a handful, even just one person that's technically proficient at this and really understands it. And if there's one person that can do it, they're going to be doing it. It's less about specific group making a choice to do something, and more about if there's somebody that knows how to do it, they're going to be looking, because ultimately what it comes down to is any threat actor is looking for a confluence of liquidity and vulnerabilities. And there are a couple of ways in which you can exploit vulnerabilities in the virtual asset ecosystem. So if you know how to do it, it's there.
Yeah, it's really well said. It's interesting in this Wall Street Journal piece about those three cases that you mentioned and the use of Telegram, Chris specifically has a line in there like, what this allows me to do is investigate cases that are happening in war-torn Syria from the comfort of my own home. But that's also true of threat actors, right? Who all you need is a laptop somewhere in the world. And we see that as North Korea is a great example of that, right? You have a country with absolutely no resources and zero GDP being on the world stage because they have a cadre of hackers that can go out and steal billions of dollars. It's the nature of the technology. You mentioned the DeFi risk assessment. I'd say of the work that the Treasury Department has done from a policy perspective over the last few years, it's pretty significant. Can you talk to us a little bit about the risk assessment, maybe like what folks should take away?
Sure. So we kind of assigned ourselves the homework of doing the DeFi risk assessment as well as the non-fungible tokens risk assessment as a product of one of the reports that came out of the executive order on responsible innovation and digital assets. And really, what we wanted to do is we kept hearing these buzzwords, DeFi, NFTs, DeFi, NFTs. And so we really wanted to take an opportunity to take a step back and think about what we're actually talking about when we use those terms and what that means in practice. And there are, I think, kind of two key pieces of that. And the first is, what does the threat landscape look like? And also, what does that mean for the vulnerabilities? What bad actors do we see taking advantage of DeFi or NFTs? And then ultimately, what does that mean for the vulnerabilities that we need to make sure that our framework domestically, that the FATF standards, the international standards for AML CFT are addressing, what needs to be built in the technology to address vulnerabilities, that type of thing. And so I think one of the key differences, though, compared to our other risk assessments, is that this had a huge background section, and same with the NFT risk assessment, because we really had, everybody generally knows how the banking system works, but we really needed to dig in and kind of come to a common understanding. When we use the term DeFi, what are we talking about in the context of this specific report? And so there were a couple of, I think, big key findings of the report. I will say in a lot of our consultations and talking to the private sector, one of the things that we heard over and over again is that there's no money laundering in DeFi because you can see everything. And while some of it is visible on public blockchains, I think one of the things that we definitely saw in the report is that there is illicit finance, there is money laundering in DeFi. And so really thinking about the different types of threat actors that are taking advantage of that, kind of walking through what that looks like in practice, what types of typologies illicit actors are using, going back to what I mentioned before, less about specific groups and more about expertise. What we did find is it wasn't North Korea uses DeFi like this, ransomware actors use DeFi like that, and, kind of breaking it down by actor. Instead, it was kind of like, there are these general typologies that we tend to see, and the degree to which any threat actor is using them depends on their level of comfort and familiarity with the technology. We also talked about some of the vulnerabilities in the DeFi ecosystem, talking about instances where DeFi services or financial institutions under the Bank Secrecy Act should have AML CFT programs in place, but perhaps we're not complying, cited some of the cases that CFTC and SEC in particular have worked on in that space, talking through some of the vulnerabilities with regards to jurisdictional arbitrage, gaps in other countries implementing the FATF standards. But I think also one of the key points in the DeFi risk assessment was also talking about the mitigation measures. We don't usually talk about that specifically as a separate section in our risk assessments, but we felt like it was important because we did want to recognize when industry was telling us, look, there's no money laundering because we can see everything. We kind of talked through why we don't fully believe that's the case, but we also do recognize that public blockchain data, some of the innovative tools that we've seen being developed in this space to build into the technology itself, some of that can be really helpful in mitigating illicit finance risk. And we really wanted to recognize that and indicate those are areas where industry should also be thinking about how to integrate those types of mitigation measures, how to build on what already exists to make it more effective.
You mentioned a lot of great things there. A key takeaway for me was obviously the expectation that, at least from a risk assessment standpoint, Treasury believes that many DeFi services do financial services today and therefore are already under the BSA. But I thought another key takeaway was this idea that this is a starting point to a conversation. And I really want our listeners to know that Treasury, and then you personally, really, really pushed that. We had a meeting at the New York Fed. I think they'd be okay with the Chatham House rules violation, but I sat next to people like Rebecca Reddick and Michael Mosier and folks who are deep in the DeFi space. I certainly was really appreciative of the opportunity to sit down and have these kinds of conversations with Treasury on these issues. You mentioned the NFT risk assessment too. Super different in my mind, like almost like a tale of two risk assessments. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so the NFT risk assessment was a bit delayed. And I think part and parcel that was due to the fact as we really started looking into it, a lot of what we were coming to realize is that there's a good deal of scams and fraud and theft in the NFT ecosystem. And that's something we certainly should be looking at. But in the context of NFTs specifically being used for money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, there was a good deal less of that. And there was also kind of a downward trend in terms of the common use of NFTs, transaction volume, price per NFTs, that I think changed the landscape a little bit. So we did kind of take a little bit more time getting that risk assessment out, given some of our competing priorities. But really taking a very similar approach, in terms of methodology with regards to the DeFi risk assessment. So really kind of trying to think about what does the NFT ecosystem look like? What do we mean when we say NFT? What do we mean when we talk about NFT platforms? Who are we talking about here? And what does that mean in practice for both risk and kind of how the regulatory framework applies? Of course, from our perspective, looking at this not as providing like interpretation or guidance, but really trying to understand risk and where our gaps might be. But I think that finding with regards to the scams and fraud piece and a little bit less focus on terrorist financing and proliferation financing is directionally important in terms of how we're kind of thinking about the threat landscape and what that looks like.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you said is that like, look, this is a risk assessment. And that means it like provides here are the risks, but also like maybe we don't see this as much of an issue today as we thought when we started writing this. And I feel like you guys were pretty public around, we're here to tell you what is a threat and what is not a threat. That's what a risk assessment is essentially.
That's exactly right. And there's certainly aspects of NFTs, I think, that should be more highly prioritized because there is risk there in terms of, maybe building in security controls for NFT platforms, or as you're building NFTs to protect them against being used for, rug pulls or malicious airdrops, things like that. There are definitely ways that NFTs can be made safer, but a lot of that actually, I think, centers around like consumer protection and literacy rather than kind of AML CFT controls. But again, I think a risk assessment is a snapshot. And so we do want to make sure that we're taking a risk-based approach and taking that into account. But we also don't want to kind of set things aside and stop looking, because we know that especially in this space, the minute you kind of move on to the next thing, it's really hard to keep up. The ecosystem evolves quite rapidly. So you got to keep eyes on all things at all times.
It's absolutely insane. I mean, like you and I are very deep in this, and like I Google crypto news like at least 20 times a day, and it changes absolutely on a dime. And the NFT risk assessment is a great example of that. You were essentially, it was very nice when you said that we decided to, or we were responding, I think you were ordered by the White House or something in the executive order to do these risk assessments. And the one on NFTs was like right in the middle of like Bored Apes and CryptoPunks and kitties and rainbows and all kinds of crazy stuff, was like absolutely everywhere. And that died down a lot. And I think we're sort of moving to a maturing space or different use cases for NFTs, but you were told to write this risk assessment at a certain moment and then ultimately wrote it in a very different moment. It's just like, it's so crazy how fast things move for sure. Let me back up a little bit. One of the coolest things you do, and I mentioned some of the times we've been together in places like Japan and Paris and really across the world, is you represent the US delegation to the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which really has been, when it comes to AML and crypto, arguably the most important voice in the world going back to 2013. Talk to me a little bit about that role for the US, but then also you personally and sort of how you've engaged there.
Yeah, it's really one of my favorite parts of my job. And really, this goes back to the FATF under the US presidency, really trying to make sure that we've been very clear about how the international AML CFT standards apply to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. And so really what the FATF did is they started by defining those terms, which in and of itself, as anybody working in this industry knows, coming up with definitions can be quite a challenge. But we came up with definitions that one can find in the FATF glossary. But there were also updates to the methodology, which the FATF uses in the mutual peer review process to evaluate AML CFT frameworks. FATF updated the recommendation. There are 40 recommendations for AML CFT standards. Recommendation 15 is on new technologies, which was originally more about kind of new products and services that financial institutions are interested in offering, really trying to make sure that they are understanding the risks before you launch a new product. And so there was a whole section of Recommendation 15 that was built out specifically focused on virtual assets, saying that countries need to have either take a ban approach or need to regulate with a licensing or registration framework for virtual asset service providers, need to assess risk for virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, and really kind of going through the key things that a country needs to have an effective AML CFT framework for virtual assets and VASPs. They also updated the interpretive note to Recommendation 15, or I think actually created a new one, which basically says all of the other 39 FATF recommendations, all of those also apply to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. And what this really means in practice is that by and large, with very few exceptions, financial institutions and VASP should have the same AML CFT obligations across the board with a couple of asterisks. And so the FATF, I think, was quite forward-leaning, especially with very active participation from the US in trying to build these international standards for virtual assets. And unfortunately, we've seen that countries have been fairly lagging in terms of implementing the FATF standards. And so the FATF has this virtual asset contact group, that's, as you've mentioned, that has a couple of key lines of effort that are working to address this. So the first puzzle piece is really trying to get those countries that don't have frameworks yet to get a framework in place, really trying to go from 0 to 1, which can be quite a challenge if you don't have the resources or the expertise. And so the BACG is really trying to help those countries get to where they need to be, get frameworks in place. Because the way we see it in the United States, but also the VACG itself and some of the work that it's done, as long as there are gaps in implementation across jurisdictions, you're going to be able to have VASPs in jurisdictions without frameworks that aren't requiring any users to provide information. They're not reporting anything to the financial intelligence unit. There's no one for law enforcement to go to and ask for information. And so really until we get those gaps filled, we're going to have some challenges. And so it's kind of that work, but then also making sure that we're also trying to stay on the cutting edge and understand how the ecosystem is changing and making sure that the standards are fit for purpose and also sharing best practices and challenges amongst countries that already do have frameworks in place.
And I could tell folks, I mean, it's really extraordinary. You're sitting around a big square room and, representatives from these, different FIUs from all over the world, essentially. And there's, threat briefings from folks like TRM on terror financing or TPRK or ransomware. But then also really robust conversations about, hey, this is what we're doing in this jurisdiction. A couple of years ago, I had someone from the Monetary Authority of Singapore on TRM talks, and they said, look, we're only as strong as our weakest link. And that's absolutely true amongst a group like this, right? And, a weak link could be not having the resources, but wanting to, or a weak link could be like Russia, where you have a network of non-compliant VASPs, and that's like, okay, because you're trying to launder ransomware funds and sanctions evasion and all of that.
Yes. I mean, I think we've said time and time again in our risk assessments that jurisdictional arbitrage is really the key risk here. As long as there are gaps, there are going to be opportunities for misuse. And that's a huge challenge.
Well, talk to me a little bit about that. So I've described this as sort of a 1-2 punch from Treasury. So on the one hand, it's guidance, it's risk assessments, it's proposed rulemakings potentially. But then on the other hand, it's enforcement. And that could mean sanctions, that could mean FinCEN authorities. What are the key actions that you've seen Treasury really take in the last couple of years?
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting framing. And I don't think I'll ever forget that in my head, it's called like ransomware summer and ransomware fall, where you had Colonial Pipeline in May. And I think truly, I mean, I want to be clear that Treasury had been thinking about ransomware and illicit finance for quite a while ahead of that. We had talked about it in our 2018 risk assessment, for example. But I mean, there was a coalescence of use of a variety of different Treasury authorities that fall, I think, in a really effective way, where you had SUETS, which was the first use of OFAC sanctions against a virtual asset service provider. We had OFAC issue an updated ransomware advisory. We had FinCEN update a ransomware advisory. So it really was. We worked with Estonia and Latvia on some of the VASPs that we designated to also take action. So there was a lot of work that was going into that to really try to not only cut off those bad actors, those key nodes that were part of the ransomware ecosystem from the US financial system, but also to message where we were seeing the risk and how we needed to be thinking about it and taking those types of actors offline. But certainly, so there is like the back end where we're doing the risk assessments and, making sure that our frameworks are fit for purpose, as you saw with some of the proposals that were sent to the Hill last fall. Those are certainly things that we're thinking about, but, in our work on jurisdictional arbitrage. But I think to your point with Russia is that sometimes we don't have a willing partner that we're able to assist, and we need to take unilateral action. And so sanctions, I think the use of FinCEN authorities as well is a really good opportunity to use our tools to disrupt those types of key nodes in the ecosystem, but also message to everybody what the risk landscape looks like and what we're focusing on. I think similarly, enforcement actions are a good, certainly trying to penalize financial institutions that fail to comply with their obligations, but also messaging to say, look, what happens when you fail to comply, when you don't meet those obligations. And then a huge wealth of information in those FinCEN and OFAC orders to talk about what compliance failures actually looked like in practice, which I think can be a pretty helpful resource for other financial institutions that are really looking to avoid those failures and mitigate risk effectively.
And that list of kind of things that you guys are doing, there have been a couple proposed rulemakings, one that is pending, I believe, on mixing transactions. I know you're probably not going to have a robust comment on a pending rulemaking, but would love your just take on sort of the way Treasury is thinking about mixers and then in the context of this NPRM, if possible.
Yeah, sure. I mean, mixers are something that we've been thinking about for quite a long time, as you've seen, certainly with the NPRM on mixing that FinCEN put out last fall, but also the designations that we've taken against Tornado Cash, Syndad, others. And then I think also some of the public statements that have been made. I think there's certainly been a recognition that we understand that there are instances in which users of virtual assets want a degree of privacy that's not immediately afforded given the nature of public blockchains. But that being said, we also see that mixers are providing a way to obfuscate the origin, movement, and destination of funds. And we've seen a variety of illicit actors really capitalize on that and take advantage of it. And to be clear, the proposed rule, ultimately, what it would do is it would require financial institutions to collect and report certain information for transactions that involve virtual asset mixing. And so it's certainly not a ban, but it's instead intended to introduce more transparency into the virtual asset sector to mitigate against that kind of exploitation of mixers as we see them operating by and large today.
It's a really complicated issue, and these are the times when I'm happy that there are really smart people like you, and maybe I'm not dealing with these issues anymore. But like you nailed it, right? Like, how do we enable lawful users a degree of privacy in an open financial system, but at the same time ensure that North Korea is not able to launder billions of dollars, through these services? And it's like, I think that's the real challenge for regulators today. I think there are technology solutions. I think we're building that at TRM. I think digital identity is going to play a huge role. I feel like we've been through a lot of this, but are there other threats?
What's really been at the forefront of our minds for quite a while are really the staples of who we've seen consistently and be, frankly, early adopters of virtual assets, and that's ransomware actors and North Korean cyber criminals. But I want to say, too, I kind of mentioned this at the outset, that we're increasingly seeing either at least a level of interest and maybe even increased usage by illicit actors across the board. I think some really good examples, IFIS-K in particular,
Yes.
increasing use of virtual assets by drug traffickers to, for example, purchase fentanyl precursors, increasingly seeing virtual asset investment scams, which are truly devastating and just shooting through the roof. So really trying to, I think, keep our eyes on what we've been looking at for quite a while, but also make sure that we're keeping up with these other threat actors that are kind of really trying to use this technology more for their own purposes and make sure that we're taking the right steps to mitigate those risks and keep up with the threat landscape. It's, I think, a constant challenge, but it's the job.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's the biggest challenge. We talk about TRM speed, which is what we have to move at to keep up with this space. But I can't even, when you think about policymakers and government, it's a huge challenge. Very, very recently, there were some significant actions against one sort of a FinCEN action and one an OFAC action related to PM2 BTC and Cryptex. It felt very consistent with this sort of a Russian money laundering state that I feel like has been a target of Treasury since the invasion of Ukraine. But anything that could sort of give us some more perspective?
Sure. I think one of the really interesting things about these actions, and I think really demonstrate how we're thinking very critically about how to use our tools in a way that we're working with domestic law enforcement and or foreign law enforcement to amplify the effect of our transactions. We recognize that, as I think to circle back as the theme throughout this, is kind of problem jurisdictions like Russia, right? A sanctions action is going to have some really strong messaging impact, but I hope and would expect that a lot of VASPs in the United States, other financial institutions, are interested in engaging with these types of actors to begin with. But the really, I think, way to amplify effectiveness that we've been really pushing is working with those foreign and domestic law enforcement actions to do things jointly, to designate something if it's taken offline, that type of thing, to really enforce the impact of the actions that we're taking.
That's awesome. And those two cases are a great example. I mean, you're talking State Department, Treasury, DOJ, really across the board. And then obviously with, foreign partners, the Dutch and others, it's like the key is us being able to leverage our authorities and our data to work closely with law enforcement. I just think it's so important. I know that we work really closely with law enforcement. IRSCI in particular loves the relationship with Treasury, obviously, just given the proximity and all of that. And it's like, how do we even work more closely together, which I think is an exciting prospect for sure. What are you into beyond all this? What do you do when you're not deep into sort of the crypto ecosystem and stopping bad actors?
Yeah, I really I love to run as well, but I've been dealing with a chronic injury that's held me back a little bit more. So I'm settling for hiking while trying to give myself space to heal. But I also do a lot of baking. I do a lot of bread. I love baking bread. and have recently gotten into sourdough, which also affords the opportunity for making sourdough chocolate chip cookies with the
Ooh,
discard, which is like, I think my new favorite thing. I do it once a weekend and just brings me happiness.
I love that. Any other, like, what's the favorite bread other than sourdough to bake?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll eat just about any bread, but I love a focaccia. I mean, like, who can go wrong with salt and olive oil on the top?
That is awesome. I love that. It is so fun to hear about the hobbies, and we'll need to do a TRM hiking club until you can get running
Right.
with us wherever we are next in the world. But Caroline, thank you so much. Like I said, I mean, we've had these conversations over the years, publicly and privately, and just love how forthcoming you are and willing to share and willing to really engage. So, thank you so much, and thanks for joining TRM Talks.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Two real takeaways from the conversation today with Caroline, and I've known her for a long time. She's really led a lot of the digital assets work at the U.S. Treasury Department. First, the Treasury is very, very engaged in the space, and that's really no surprise. I mean, we've seen guidance from FinCEN, the Financial Intelligence Unit for the United States, the anti-money laundering regulator, for years, really early days. They were putting out guidance on anti-money laundering. But in the last few years, we've seen sort of a continued and even more sophisticated approach when it comes to risk assessments for DeFi and NFTs. And Caroline has led a lot of that work as well. But then it's also the engagement globally with the Financial Action Task Force, where she's chaired the Virtual Asset Contact Group, really the crypto working group for all of FATF, the UN of anti-money laundering. So Treasury's really engaged in this space. We've seen OFAC take action against mixing services and non-compliant cryptocurrency exchanges. So I think really important to understand Treasury's critical role in the space. I think the other key takeaway is that there's a narrative that sometimes comes from the crypto industry that, essentially regulators don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the technology. I think at Treasury, career civil servants like Caroline, like colleagues like Julie Lascar and Scott Rembrandt and others really do understand this tech. They deeply understand the tech and are out there engaging with industry. The DeFi risk assessment is a great example. We talked about them hosting roundtables, which TRM and others participated in. On the NFT risk assessment, I thought it was great to hear from Caroline that she said, look, one thing that's our job is to provide insights on these are real risks, right? These are risks we're seeing, and these are risks we're not seeing in the case of NFTs. So I thought really, but two biggest takeaways for me were the critical nature and the importance of the work Treasury's doing in this space to target really the illicit pieces of the overall lawful ecosystem, but then also the expertise that Caroline and her colleagues really bring to the table every day. Next on TRM Talks, I sit down with Ronit Ghosh, head of Citi's Future of Finance and the author of Future Money. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it, and follow us on LinkedIn to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.